When Jamal Carter, a successful black CEO, stops for a quiet breakfast in a small-town diner, he becomes the target of Officer Daniels, a racist cop who abuses his authority to harass and humiliate him. What begins with subtle microaggressions escalates into a shocking display of racism, as Daniels pushes Jamal to the brink, believing his power makes him untouchable. Fueled by prejudice and arrogance, Daniels underestimates Jamal's strength and resolve, igniting a confrontation that exposes the deep injustices within the system. How far will this abuse of power go? And will Jamal fight back? The cafe's bell chimed softly as Jamal Carter stepped inside, his tailored coat pulled snug against the chill of the morning. The place was quaint, worn wooden floors, the hiss of a coffee machine, and the soft hum of idle chatter. It wasn't the kind of place where Jamal would usually stop, but today, he needed a moment of quiet away from the chaos of his corporate life. A few patrons glanced up briefly before returning to their meals. Jamal didn't mind, he was used to being overlooked in rooms where he didn't seem to fit. With a polite nod, he approached the counter. "Just a black coffee, please," he said, his voice calm and measured. The barista, a young man with shaggy blonde hair, offered a hesitant smile. "Coming right up, sir." Jamal moved to a corner table by the window, the steaming cup soon cradled in his hands. He allowed himself a breath, watching the street outside as pedestrians hustled by. It was peaceful almost. The quiet didn't last long. The heavy thud of boots against the wooden floor drew his attention. Jamal glanced up, just as a figure loomed in the doorway: Officer Daniels. His blue uniform seemed to bristle with authority, the polished badge catching the cafe's light. Jamal didn't know him, but he recognized the type. The officer's eyes swept the room before locking onto Jamal. Daniels moved toward him, boots echoing in the small space, stopping just close enough to cast a shadow over Jamal's table. "You waiting for someone?" Daniels' voice carried the faintest edge of suspicion, like an unsheathed blade. Jamal met the officer's gaze, calm and steady. "Just having my coffee." Daniels' brow furrowed, and his lip twitched in something between a smirk and a sneer. "Funny, you don't look like you belong here." Jamal raised an eyebrow, his grip tightening slightly around the coffee cup. "Didn't realize coffee came with a membership card?" The barista glanced nervously toward them, sensing the tension, but said nothing. Around the room, the other patrons grew quiet, their eyes darting between Jamal and Daniels. The officer leaned in just a little, his voice dropping to a level only Jamal could hear. "I'll ask again, you waiting for someone, or are you just here to make people uncomfortable?" Jamal's jaw tensed, but his voice remained cool. "I'm not here to bother anyone, officer, just enjoying my morning." Daniels scoffed, straightening to his full height, towering over the seated Jamal. "I don't like seeing strangers sitting around like they own the place. Makes folks nervous. So why don't you finish that coffee and move along?" Jamal set his cup down with deliberate care. His gaze, unwavering, met the officer's. "I didn't realize sitting quietly in a cafe was cause for concern." "Maybe it's not," Daniels replied, his smirk sharpening. "But maybe you're just the kind of guy who thinks the rules don't apply to him." Jamal's expression hardened ever so slightly, his voice turning to steel. "I don't break rules, officer. I follow them." For a moment, neither man spoke, the silence between them crackling with tension. Daniels stared at Jamal, his fingers twitching by his belt, as if waiting, hoping, for Jamal to give him a reason to escalate. Jamal didn't move. Finally, Daniels let out a cold chuckle, though there was no humor in it. "Well? Don't take too long, Mr. Suit. You might outstay your welcome." Jamal watched as the officer turned and walked away, the weight of his presence lingering like a bad taste in the air. Around the cafe, the quiet murmurs slowly resumed, but Jamal could feel the uneasy glances. He picked up his coffee again, hands steady despite the storm brewing inside him. It wasn't over. It never was. Jamal Carter eased his sleek black sedan into the gravel parking lot of Ruby's Diner. It wasn't the kind of place someone of his stature typically frequented. A small, unassuming restaurant off a back road just outside of Millbrook. The paint on the sign was chipped, the neon letters flickering as if they couldn't quite decide whether to stay lit. But Jamal didn't mind. This place had history. Stepping out of the car, he adjusted his coat against the early winter wind. His shoes crunched softly against the gravel as he glanced toward the diner. Through the frosted windows, he could see the low hum of life. A few patrons hunched over plates of eggs, the clink of silverware against ceramic, the occasional laugh muffled by the glass. It was cozy, small-town simple. For Jamal, it was a moment of peace, a step outside the corporate machine. He didn't dress like a man who sat at the helm of a billion-dollar investment firm. His tailored trench coat and pressed slacks hinted at refinement, but his presence, subtle and unassuming, had a kind of quiet strength that didn't rely on appearances. Jamal carried himself like a man who didn't need to prove anything. Those who knew him, truly knew him, respected that those who didn't, well, they often mistook his calm demeanor for something it wasn't. The bell above the door let out a cheery jingle as Jamal stepped inside. The diner smelled of coffee, bacon, and the faint sweetness of pancakes. A young waitress, probably no older than 20, glanced up from behind the counter and offered him a hesitant smile. "Morning, sir. Take a seat wherever you like," she said, her voice polite but unsure. Jamal gave a slight nod of thanks, his warm brown eyes scanning the room. There were only 3 other customers, an elderly couple in the corner, quietly sharing a newspaper, and a man with a baseball cap and work jacket, nursing a steaming mug of coffee. None of them paid Jamal much attention. He picked a table by the window, his favorite spot in places like these. It gave him a clear view of the world outside, the slow crawl of trucks passing on the nearby road, the dull gray sky that hinted at snow. For a man who spent most of his life in high-rise boardrooms, with ceilings so high they seemed to swallow you, there was something grounding about rubies. Jamal placed his phone face down on the table. He wouldn't need it here. This was his retreat, his pause, even if it only lasted a cup of coffee. The waitress approached, a small notepad in hand. Her blonde hair was pulled back into a tight ponytail, and she seemed to bounce nervously on her feet as she stopped at his table. "What can I get you?" "Black coffee, please," Jamal replied, his voice deep and smooth. "And, 2 eggs scrambled with toast." She scribbled the order down quickly, avoiding eye contact. "Sure thing, coffee's coming right up." As she hurried back behind the counter, Jamal leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifting to the couple across the room. The older man adjusted his glasses, turning the page of the newspaper with a slow, deliberate motion. His wife sipped her tea, her hands wrapped around the mug, as if for warmth. The quiet comfort between them made Jamal smile faintly. It was a life he rarely glimpsed. Simple, unhurried. His days were packed with meetings, negotiations, and high-stakes decisions that sent shockwaves through markets. His name was known in the world of business, whispered with reverence or envy, depending on who you asked. Yet here, he was just another face. The coffee arrived moments later, placed in front of him with a small ceramic clink. "Sugar and cream are on the table," the waitress mumbled before retreating again. Jamal wrapped his hands around the mug, savoring its warmth. The diner's radio hummed softly in the background, a classic tune crackling through the old speakers. He let his shoulders relax, the tension of the week slowly bleeding away. That was until the door chimed again. Jamal didn't look up at first, but he felt it, a shift in the air. The scrape of boots against the linoleum floor, the deliberate way they moved. It was the sound of someone who wanted to be noticed. "Morning, Officer Daniels," the waitress called, her tone brightening. Officer Daniels. The name was familiar. Jamal's eyes flicked toward the man who'd just entered, broad-shouldered, late 40s, with a mustache and an expression that seemed permanently set to displeased. His uniform, Millbrook Police Department, was crisp, the badge on his chest polished to a gleam. Daniels didn't reply to the waitress, only grunted as he adjusted his belt and scanned the room. His eyes landed on Jamal, lingering a little too long before he finally walked toward the counter. "Coffee," Daniels said, his voice rough. The waitress scrambled to pour him a cup, but Jamal could feel it now, the officer's gaze sliding back to him. He didn't return it. Instead, he took another slow sip of coffee, his fingers steady on the mug. "Where's your truck, officer?" the man in the baseball cap called from across the diner. "Thought you didn't patrol this side of town." Daniels let out a short chuckle, the sound humorless. "Just keeping an eye on things, you know how it is." The baseball cap man didn't respond, But Jamal could feel Daniels's presence growing heavier by the second, as though the officer had shifted his focus entirely onto him. "You new around here?" Daniels finally said, his voice carrying across the room. Jamal glanced up, his expression calm but direct. "No?" Daniels smirked, taking a slow sip from his cup. "Don't recall seeing you before." Jamal didn't flinch under the scrutiny. He'd met men like Daniels before, men who wore authority like a weapon. "Just passing through," he replied evenly. Daniels stared at him for a long moment, his mustache twitching as if he were weighing his next words carefully. "Passing through, huh, funny? Don't see many folks like you around here, especially dressed like that." The words hung in the air like a challenge, subtle but sharp. The waitress froze mid-step, glancing nervously between the two men. Even the couple in the corner had stopped pretending to read the paper, their eyes flicking up cautiously. Jamal held Daniel's gaze, unbothered. "What can I say? I like good coffee." There was nothing overtly confrontational in his tone, but something about Jamal's composure seemed to grate on Daniels. The officer's jaw tightened, his knuckles whitening against the coffee mug. "You on business or something?" Daniels pressed, taking a step closer. "Not today," Jamal replied, his voice smooth. "Just enjoying my morning." Daniels scoffed, loud enough to draw attention. "Must be nice to take it easy. Some of us don't have that luxury." The words were weighted, loaded with implication. Jamal knew the game Daniels was playing, testing him, prodding for a reaction. But Jamal Carter wasn't a man who rose to bait. He set his coffee down gently, his calm unwavering. "It is nice," he said. "Everyone deserves a little peace now and then." The officer's smirk faltered for just a moment, as if he didn't know what to do with the lack of fear or deference. He opened his mouth to say something else, when the waitress interrupted, her voice high and tight. "Your food's coming right up, sir," she said quickly, looking at Jamal with an apologetic tilt to her smile. Jamal nodded his thanks, but he didn't miss the way Daniel's eyes narrowed at him, the quiet challenge still lingering in the air. The officer turned back toward the counter, muttering something under his breath that Jamal couldn't hear. The tension in the diner seemed to loosen ever so slightly as Daniels leaned against the counter, sipping his coffee in silence. But Jamal knew it wasn't over. Men like Officer Daniels never let things go that easily. Jamal picked up his cup again, holding it steady in his hand. Outside the window, the first flurries of snow began to fall, dusting the ground like ash. "Enjoy your coffee," he thought to himself, "while you still can." Jamal sat back in his chair, his eyes drifting toward the diner's window as the snowfall thickened. He'd hoped for a quiet morning, but Officer Daniels's presence had shifted the air. The low murmur of conversations had returned, but there was an undercurrent of tension, an awareness that lingered like smoke after a fire. He knew it well. The waitress returned with his plate, her hands slightly shaky as she set it down. "Here you go," she mumbled. Avoiding his gaze, Jamal offered a quiet, "Thank you," and she hurried off again, her sneakers squeaking faintly against the linoleum. Jamal picked up his fork and took a bite, refusing to let Daniels ruin his breakfast. Years of navigating boardrooms filled with skeptical glances and unspoken judgments had taught him one thing: the calmest man in the room usually won. But Daniels didn't seem ready to let it rest. The officer's heavy boots echoed again as he moved, this time toward Jamal's table. He stopped directly beside it, his shadow stretching over the plate like a stain. Jamal didn't look up immediately, taking his time to finish chewing before setting down his fork. "Is there something I can help you with, officer?" Jamal asked, his tone polite but firm. Daniel's lip curled slightly, his mustache twitching. "Just doing my job, making sure everything's in order." Jamal arched a brow, meeting his gaze with practiced calm. "Did something look out of order to you?" Daniels's eyes flickered with irritation, but he didn't step back. "Don't get smart with me. I just find it curious. A man like you in a place like this." "A man like me," Jamal repeated softly. Though the words felt sharp, Daniels smirked, clearly pleased to have touched a nerve. "You don't exactly fit the usual crowd. Fancy coat, fancy car? Makes me wonder what you're really doing here." Jamal let the silence settle between them before answering. "I'm having breakfast." Daniels's voice dropped, low enough that only Jamal could hear. "Sure you are. You wouldn't be the first to think you could walk in wherever you wanted." Jamal's jaw tensed, But he didn't give Daniels the satisfaction of a visible reaction. Instead, he folded his hands neatly on the table, his expression impassive. "Last I checked, officer, sitting down for a meal isn't against the law." Daniels leaned in slightly, the smugness in his voice grating. "That depends. If I start hearing complaints about loitering or disturbing the peace, we might have a problem." Jamal held his gaze. He could feel the other patrons pretending not to listen, their nervous glances betraying them. Daniels wasn't just trying to intimidate him. He was performing, staking his claim in front of an audience that wouldn't challenge him. "Is this how you protect and serve?" Jamal asked evenly. Daniels' smirk faltered for a brief moment, the comment landing like a stone in his gut. Then his sneer returned, sharper this time. "You watch that mouth, Mr. Respect goes both ways." Jamal exhaled slowly through his nose, forcing his anger back into its cage. This wasn't new. The faces changed, the uniforms changed, but the game was always the same: push, prod, provoke, and wait for a slip, a reaction that could be used to justify the mistreatment. He wasn't going to give Daniels that. "I've shown you nothing but respect," Jamal said quietly. "And I expect the same in return." Daniels straightened, eyes narrowing. He looked like a man who had expected an easy victory, and didn't know what to do when it didn't come. "Finish up your coffee and move along," he said gruffly. "Wouldn't want to overstay your welcome." Jamal didn't respond. He picked up his fork again, cutting into his eggs with deliberate care. Daniel stood there for a moment longer, the silence simmering between them, before finally turning and walking back toward the counter. The waitress gave him a nervous glance, but Daniels ignored her, muttering into his radio, as if to remind everyone who held authority in the room. By the time Jamal finished his meal, the tension in the diner was palpable. He could feel the weight of unspoken words pressing down on him, the silent complicity of the room. The elderly couple hadn't looked in his direction since Daniels had approached his table. The man in the baseball cap kept sneaking glances, his expression unreadable. Jamal stood, adjusting his coat as he placed a crisp $20 bill on the table. The waitress, who had been wiping down the counter, looked up quickly. "Keep the change," Jamal said softly, offering a small nod. Her face flushed as she whispered, "Thank you." As he turned to leave, Daniels spoke up again, his voice just loud enough for everyone to hear. "Safe travels, sir." Jamal paused in the doorway, his hand on the handle. He glanced back over his shoulder, meeting Daniels's smug gaze. "You take care now, officer." There was no malice in Jamal's tone, only a quiet strength that seemed to chip away at Daniel's confidence. For a moment, the officer's smirk faltered, though he quickly recovered, his eyes narrowing in response. Jamal pushed the door open and stepped outside. The cold air hit him like a slap, but it was refreshing, free of the heavy, stifling tension inside the diner. He walked toward his car, the gravel crunching beneath his shoes, his breath curling in the crisp winter air. He was halfway to the sedan when a voice called out behind him. "Excuse me, sir." Jamal turned, his shoulders still relaxed, though the weariness had begun to settle in his bones. A second officer had pulled up. This one younger, maybe in his early 30s, with a sharp, clean-shaven face. He walked toward Jamal quickly, one hand resting near his belt. "Is there a problem?" Jamal asked, keeping his voice steady. The young officer, Bennett, according to his name tag, gestured toward the diner. "We got a report of suspicious behavior. I'm going to need to see some ID." Jamal's fingers curled slightly against his palm, but he forced himself to remain calm. He glanced toward the diner window, and wasn't surprised to see Daniels standing just inside, arms crossed and smirking like he'd won. He called this in. "Suspicious behavior," Jamal repeated. "What exactly does that mean?" Bennett didn't falter. "Just routine procedure, sir. I'm sure you understand." "Routine," Jamal echoed softly, his gaze hardening. He reached into his coat pocket slowly, deliberately, and pulled out his wallet. He retrieved his driver's license and handed it over, without a word. Bennett took it, glancing at the name and address. Something flickered in his expression. Surprise, perhaps recognition, but he masked it quickly. "You live in Millbrook?" "I do," Jamal said flatly. "Is that a problem?" "No, sir," Bennett replied quickly, though his tone was clipped. He handed the license back, hesitating for just a moment. What brings you out here this morning? Breakfast, Jamal said simply, his eyes unwavering. Bennett shifted uncomfortably, as if realizing how ridiculous he sounded. Right. Well, sorry for the inconvenience, Mr. Carter. Jamal slid his license back into his wallet, his movements precise and measured. Have a good day, officer. Bennett muttered something under his breath before walking back to his squad car. Jamal turned to his sedan, his jaw tight as he opened the door. Inside the diner, he could still see Daniels watching him, smug and satisfied. It was the look of a man who thought he'd won, who believed his badge gave him the power to humiliate whoever he pleased. Jamal sat in the driver's seat for a long moment, his fingers gripping the steering wheel as his pulse thudded in his ears. He closed his eyes, inhaling deeply, forcing himself to let the anger drain out of him, slow and steady, like poison leaving his body. But it wasn't gone. Not completely. Men like Daniels thrived on pushing people like Jamal to the brink, testing their patience, daring them to lose control. And while Jamal had held his ground, kept his composure, he could feel the weight of it all pressing down on him. The worst part was knowing it didn't matter who he was, CEO or not, wealthy or not, powerful or not. Daniels hadn't seen Jamal Carter. He'd only seen what he wanted to see. Jamal opened his eyes, staring through the windshield at the diner's glowing sign. His reflection stared back at him in the glass, calm but unyielding. This isn't over, he thought to himself. Not by a long shot. Jamal gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. The rhythmic thud of his heartbeat echoed in his ears, but he kept his breathing steady. He'd dealt with worse, boardrooms filled with cutthroat executives looking to devour him, journalists digging for cracks in his armor, people who smiled to his face and plotted behind his back. But there was something about men like Officer Daniels, about the blatant audacity they carried, that struck deeper. Jamal's phone buzzed on the passenger seat. He glanced at the screen. Mitchell. Mitchell was Jamal's right-hand man, his closest confidant at Carter Investments. A seasoned lawyer and strategist, Mitchell had a way of smoothing out even the most tangled problems. Jamal reached for the phone, swiping to answer. Morning, Mitchell. Jamal, where are you? You missed the call with Hartford. Mitchell's voice was calm, but tinged with concern. Everything okay? I'm fine, Jamal replied, his voice steady. Had a situation this morning. Mitchell exhaled sharply. A situation? What happened? Jamal looked back at the diner, at Daniels's shadowy figure still watching from inside. I'll tell you later. For now, I need you to look into a name for me, Officer Daniels, Millbrook PD. Something tells me he's not just another small-town cop. There was a pause on the line. You sure about this, Jamal? Mitchell asked carefully. What are we walking into? Jamal's jaw tightened. I don't know yet, but when I find out, I plan to shine a light on it. All right, I'll get my team on it, Mitchell replied. You're not alone in this. Call me if you need anything. Jamal hung up and started the engine, the soft rumble breaking the brittle silence inside the car. He pulled out of the lot, feeling Daniel's gaze burn into the back of his head as he drove away. Jamal spent the rest of the morning at his office in downtown Millbrook. The glass walls and minimalist decor were a far cry from Ruby's diner, but even surrounded by wealth and power, he couldn't shake the sting of Daniel's words. He buried himself in work, crunching numbers and reviewing contracts, but his mind kept returning to that diner. The deliberate way Daniels had tried to dehumanize him. By noon, Mitchell called back. You were right, he said, his voice clipped. Officer Ryan Daniels has a Record A sealed record, mind you, but I found whispers, complaints about excessive force, racial profiling, and abuse of power. Jamal's grip on the phone tightened. How is he still on the force? Mitchell sighed. Small-town politics. You know how it goes? He's got friends in high places, an old-school police chief, a judge who's turned a blind eye more than once. Daniels operates like he's untouchable, and for the most part, he has been. Jamal sat back in his chair, the weight of the truth settling on his chest. It's time someone put a stop to it. Careful, Jamal, Mitchell warned. Guys like Daniels don't back down quietly. If you push him, he'll push back harder. I'm not afraid of Daniels, Jamal said firmly. It's men like him who count on people like me staying silent. I won't. Mitchell was quiet for a beat. What's your plan? Jamal's gaze hardened. I'm going to make sure Daniels answers for who he is, for what he's done, and I'm going to do it the right way. With facts, witnesses, and proof. Men like him think they're above consequences because no one calls them out. I'll make sure he's called out. You're playing with fire, Jamal, Mitchell replied softly. But I'm with you. Jamal nodded to himself. Good. I'll call you if I need backup. That evening, Jamal returned to his Millbrook estate, a sprawling property tucked behind a gated entrance. The house was understated but elegant, designed not to flaunt wealth but to embody quiet refinement. Jamal liked it that way. He parked the sedan and stepped inside, loosening his tie as he made his way to the kitchen. He was pouring himself a glass of water when the motion sensors outside flickered, bright lights cutting through the dark. Jamal frowned, setting the glass down. He glanced toward the window and froze. 2 police cruisers had pulled up to his gate. Blue and red lights flashed against the black night, casting an ominous glow across his lawn. Jamal's pulse quickened. He walked calmly to the front door and stepped outside onto the porch, his face a mask of composure. The gate buzzed as one of the officers barked into a speaker. Jamal Carter, open the gate. We need to have a word. Jamal pressed the intercom button. What's this about? The officer didn't answer, but Jamal recognized the voice. Daniels. With a slow breath, Jamal unlocked the gate remotely, watching as the cruisers rolled up the driveway. 2 officers stepped out, and sure enough, Daniels was one of them. He approached with that same swagger, the smugness practically radiating off him. What can I do for you, Officer Daniels? Jamal asked evenly, his voice carrying across the cold night. Daniels stopped at the bottom of the porch steps, his hand resting on his belt. We received a report of stolen property matching the description of your vehicle. Jamal's brows lifted slightly. Excuse me? Daniels smirked. That car of yours, a black luxury sedan, right? Matches a description we got earlier tonight. Jamal's patience wavered. You and I both know that's absurd. My vehicle is registered to me, you're welcome to check the paperwork. Daniels took a slow step closer, his boots heavy against the pavement. We'll get to that. But until we clear this up, I'm going to need you to step down here and answer some questions. Jamal remained perfectly still, his voice low and steady. You're escalating a situation that doesn't exist, Officer Daniels. What's this really about? Daniels' smirk faltered, replaced by a harder glare. Don't get smart, either you cooperate, or we can do this the hard way. The threat hung heavy in the air, and Jamal felt it, an old familiar anger rising in his chest. But he didn't let it show. Instead, he slowly descended the steps, stopping just a foot away from Daniels. Run the paperwork, Jamal said, his voice measured, and when you find that everything is in order, I'll expect an apology. Daniels chuckled darkly. You really think you're in a position to demand apologies? Before Jamal could respond, Daniels nodded to his partner. The younger officer stepped forward, handcuffs glinting in his grip. Wait! What are you doing? Jamal asked, the first edge of disbelief creeping into his voice. Detaining you for questioning, Daniels replied smugly. Just a precaution. You have no grounds for this, Jamal said sharply, stepping back. Daniels' expression hardened, and he took a step closer. You resisting, Carter? Jamal froze, his pulse pounding in his ears. He could see where this was going. Daniels was baiting him again, hoping for a reaction, something he could twist and exploit. I'm not resisting, Jamal said quietly, his voice tight with controlled fury. But this is harassment, and you know it. Daniels sneered. We'll let the station decide that. The younger officer grabbed Jamal's wrist roughly, snapping the cold metal cuffs around it. Jamal clenched his jaw, his free hand tightening into a fist, before he forced himself to relax. He couldn't let them win. Not like this. As the officers led him toward the cruiser, Jamal glanced back at his house, its warm lights glowing in the dark. This was his home, his life, earned through years of hard work and sacrifice. And now, in mere minutes, Daniels had tried to strip that away, reducing him to something small, something disposable. As he ducked into the back of the police car, Jamal's mind raced. Anger simmered beneath the surface, but alongside it was something sharper, something stronger. Resolve. This wasn't over. Jamal sat tall in the back seat, his eyes fixed on the road ahead as the cruiser pulled away from his estate. Daniels might have thought he'd won, but Jamal Carter wasn't a man who backed down. He would fight back, not with anger, but with truth. And when the time came, Daniels would answer for everything. The story ends with Jamal being wrongfully detained, setting up a powerful climax where he must face the injustice head-on while using his influence, intellect, and allies to bring the truth to light. Jamal gripped the steering wheel, staring straight ahead as the diner faded in the rearview mirror. The snowfall had thickened into a slow, relentless curtain, dusting the road ahead in quiet white. His thoughts churned, heavy and sharp. He was no stranger to moments like this, where the dignity he'd earned was stripped away by men who saw only what they wanted to see. Daniels wasn't unique. He was a symptom, a representation of a rot Jamal had spent his life fighting through. Still, this morning sat heavier than most. Jamal knew he could let it go. He could return to his pristine office, resume business meetings and conference calls, let Daniels and his smug superiority evaporate into nothingness. But there was something about this time, about the cold audacity of it, that stayed with him like a splinter under the skin. His phone buzzed on the passenger seat. Jamal glanced over and saw the name flash across the screen. Mitchell. Perfect timing. Mitchell was Jamal's attorney and oldest confidant. Jamal reached for the phone, holding it to his ear as he kept his eyes on the road. "Morning, Mitch," he said evenly. "Jamal." Mitchell's voice carried a sharp edge, the kind of tone that said he already knew something was wrong. "Word travels fast. I just got a call from a local reporter. Something about an incident at a diner. What happened?" Jamal exhaled slowly, measuring his words. "It was Daniels." Mitchell cursed under his breath. "That Daniels officer, Ryan Daniels, the one who's been hanging over the town like a bad storm cloud for years. What did he do?" "Started small," Jamal said, his voice low, calm. "The usual intimidation routine. I didn't take the bait." He paused. "Then he sent a second officer after me on my way out, called me in as suspicious." "Jesus," Mitchell muttered. "What's your plan?" Jamal turned the corner toward his office building, the slick roads forcing him to slow. "For now, I'm going to handle my day, but I want you to start digging. Everything you can on Daniels. I have a feeling this isn't just one bad cop, it's a pattern." Mitchell's silence spoke volumes. "You're making a play here, Jamal. You sure you want to poke this bear? Daniels has friends in high places, people who look the other way." Jamal's grip on the wheel tightened. "Then it's about time someone made them look. If Daniels thought he could bully me into silence, he picked the wrong man." Mitchell sighed, though Jamal could hear the trace of pride in his voice. "All right, I'll pull records, see what I can find. But Jamal, watch your back, this town protects its own." "They're not my own," Jamal said quietly, before ending the call. Jamal's office was a sanctuary of polished wood, muted colors, and quiet efficiency. By mid-afternoon, he'd settled into his normal rhythm, reviewing financial reports, handling client calls. But he couldn't shake the memory of Daniel's smug face. The receptionist's voice broke his focus through the intercom. "Mr. Carter, there are 2 officers here to see you. They didn't say why." Jamal's stomach dropped, though his voice remained steady. "Send them up." He stood and adjusted his tie, squaring his shoulders. When the door opened, 2 uniformed officers stepped inside. Daniels led the way. Of course he did. The younger officer, Bennett, trailed behind, his expression tight and uncomfortable. "Mr. Carter," Daniels said, his tone thick with mock politeness. "Mind if we have a word?" Jamal raised a brow, motioning to the chairs in front of his desk. "I assume this is more than a social visit." Daniels ignored the invitation, choosing instead to loom by the desk. "We received a complaint earlier today, something about you causing a disturbance at Ruby's diner." "A disturbance?" Jamal repeated coolly. "I drank my coffee, paid my bill, and left. Who exactly filed this complaint?" Daniel's smirk widened. "Does it matter I'm following up, like any good officer should?" "You're following up," Jamal said slowly, meeting Daniel's gaze. "Or you're continuing to harass me because I didn't let you intimidate me this morning." Bennett shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting between the 2 men. Daniel's smile thinned. "Careful, Mr. Carter. That sounds a lot like an accusation." "It's not an accusation," Jamal replied evenly. "It's an observation." Daniels leaned closer, his voice dropping to a low hiss. "You might want to watch your step. Men like you tend to draw the wrong kind of attention." Jamal felt his temper flare, but he didn't let it surface. Instead, he folded his hands on the desk, his gaze unwavering. "And what kind of man am I, Officer Daniels?" Daniels' face darkened, the mask of professionalism slipping. "The kind that thinks a suit and a title make you untouchable. But you're not here." Bennett cleared his throat, his voice hesitant. "Daniels, maybe we should—" "Quiet!" Daniels snapped, not breaking eye contact with Jamal. "I'm not finished." Jamal's voice, when it came, was soft but razor-sharp. "You've made yourself very clear, officer. Now let me make something clear to you. I have nothing to hide. You, on the other hand, seem very eager to cover your tracks. Makes me wonder what you're so afraid of." Daniel's nostrils flared, his fists clenching at his sides. For a brief moment, Jamal thought he might lose control entirely, but then the officer straightened, forcing a smirk back onto his face. "We'll see about that," Daniels said, his voice low and dangerous. "Enjoy the rest of your day, Mr. Carter." With that, he turned and stormed out of the office, Bennett trailing after him. Jamal watched them go, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew men like Daniels, men who couldn't stand the idea of being challenged, especially by someone they viewed as less. Daniels wasn't going to let this go. And neither was Jamal. That evening, Jamal sat in his study at home, the room bathed in the warm glow of a desk lamp. A stack of legal documents lay spread before him, courtesy of Mitchell. They detailed complaints against Officer Daniels spanning nearly a decade. Allegations of harassment, racial profiling, even excessive force. Each case had been quietly dismissed. Each victim had been silenced. Jamal's jaw tightened as he read patterns. Mitchell had been right. Daniels was protected, shielded by a network of complacent colleagues and a system designed to bury the truth. But Jamal wasn't going to let that happen again. A notification pinged on his laptop, pulling his attention. It was an email from a local journalist Jamal had spoken with once before, someone with a reputation for uncovering corruption. Subject: Daniels and Millbrook PD. The email was short, but direct. "I've been hearing whispers about Daniels for years, but no one's had the courage to push back. If you're serious about bringing this into the light, I want to hear your story. Let's talk." Jamal stared at the screen, his pulse quickening. He could feel the pieces aligning. Daniels had pushed him, underestimated him, assumed he'd walk away like all the others. But Jamal wasn't walking away. He closed the laptop and leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. The stakes had never been higher. Daniels wasn't just one man, he was part of something bigger, something rotten. Taking him down meant exposing everything, and Jamal knew there would be consequences, but there was no turning back. The phone buzzed, and Jamal picked it up. Mitchell's voice came through, low and serious. "Jamal, I found something else. It's bigger than Daniels. It goes all the way up. You're kicking a hornet's nest here." Jamal's voice was calm, resolute. "Good." Mitchell paused. "You ready for this?" Jamal stared out the window, the snow swirling in the darkness. He thought of Daniel's smirk, of the people who'd come before him and been silenced. "More than ready," he said quietly. Jamal stepped out of his car, the gravel crunching beneath his feet. Snow still swirled in soft spirals around him, but it did nothing to dull the fire building in his chest. The small Millbrook police station stood before him, squat and unassuming, its fluorescent lights glowing faintly in the dim evening haze. Mitchell had called 10 minutes ago. "Jamal, they're moving. Daniels filed a formal complaint against you, accusing you of aggressive behavior and obstruction this morning. They're trying to turn the tables." Jamal knew what this was. Retaliation. Daniels wasn't just trying to silence him, he was trying to ruin him. A formal complaint meant headlines, public scrutiny, the kind of noise that could tarnish reputations overnight. Daniels had underestimated him before, but this time, he was coming for everything, and Jamal was done playing nice. As Jamal entered the station, the heavy door closing with a dull thud behind him, heads turned. The few officers seated at their desks paused, pens halting mid-scratch. Jamal walked with calm purpose, his polished shoes clicking against the scuffed linoleum floor. He spotted Daniels near the front desk, laughing with two officers. The moment Daniels saw him, The smug grin dropped. Jamal didn't stop until he was standing directly in front of him, close enough that Daniels had to tilt his chin up slightly to hold his gaze. "Well, look who decided to show up," Daniels drawled, his voice laced with fake amusement. "You lost again, Mr. Carter, or did you come back to cause another scene?" Jamal ignored the bait. He stood tall, calm, a mountain in a storm. "I heard about the complaint you filed." Daniels smirked, leaning against the counter with false casualness. "Oh, that just following protocol. You made quite the impression this morning." Jamal's voice was quiet, but it carried an edge sharp enough to cut steel. "You're trying to frame me. Why don't you drop the act and tell me what this is really about?" The room had grown silent, the other officers watching the confrontation with thinly veiled interest. Daniels' expression darkened, his false politeness slipping. "Watch your tone, Carter. You don't get to come in here and make demands." Jamal didn't back down. "What I'm demanding, Daniels, is accountability for you, and for every abuse of power you've been allowed to get away with." Daniels' face went red, the vein on his temple pulsing. He took a step forward, close enough that Jamal could smell the cheap coffee on his breath. "Accountability?" he sneered. "You think you can walk in here, in my house, and lecture me about accountability, men like you?" "Finish that sentence," Jamal cut in sharply. Daniels froze, the words dying on his tongue. Jamal's calm, unyielding gaze pinned him in place, his silence louder than any shout. "You want to talk about men like me?" Jamal said, his voice low, each word deliberate. "Go ahead, say it because you've been saying it all day, Daniels. Just not out loud." Daniels' jaw tightened, his face a mask of barely contained rage. "I don't owe you an explanation, Carter." "No," Jamal said, his voice steady, "but you owe this town one." The silence was heavy. Jamal could feel the weight of the room, the nervous shuffling of officers, the averted gazes. Daniels' authority had kept them silent for years, but Jamal could sense the cracks in the facade. "You think your badge gives you power," Jamal continued, his voice rising just enough to fill the room. "But power isn't fear, it isn't bullying people into silence, it isn't tearing down a man's dignity because you think you can get away with it. That isn't strength, Daniels. It's cowardice." Daniels stepped even closer, his eyes blazing. "You don't know a damn thing about me." "I know enough," Jamal shot back. "I know that every complaint filed against you was swept under the rug. I know about the families you harassed, the men you've humiliated, the trust you've destroyed. You've been hiding behind that badge for years, but the truth is out now. I made sure of it." Daniels' expression flickered, just a moment of uncertainty. "What the hell are you talking about?" Jamal reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folder, holding it up for Daniels to see. "This is everything. Your history, your complaints, your misconduct, names, dates, evidence. Your career is built on intimidation and cover-ups, but that stops today." Daniels lunged forward, his voice a snarl. "You think a bunch of papers changes anything? You're delusional." Jamal didn't flinch. "No, Daniels, what changes things is people knowing the truth, and they will." The front door swung open, and Jamal turned just in time to see Mitchell stride in, flanked by a reporter and a cameraman holding a news station logo on his jacket. The officers in the room exchanged nervous glances, some taking a step back, as the cameraman hoisted his equipment onto his shoulder. "What is this?" Daniels barked, spinning to face them. "Transparency," Jamal said, his voice calm. Mitchell handed a stack of files to the reporter, his expression hard. "We've gathered years' worth of evidence, incidents of racial profiling, harassment, and abuse of power under Officer Daniels' watch. Mr. Carter thought it was time someone brought it to light." Daniels' face turned crimson. "This is a stunt," he spat. "This is slander." "No, Daniels," Jamal interrupted. "This is justice." The reporter turned to Jamal, her voice firm but curious. "Mr. Carter, are you saying Officer Daniels has a pattern of systemic abuse?" "I'm not saying it," Jamal replied, meeting Daniels' enraged gaze. "The evidence says it." "You son of a—" Daniels lunged again, but this time, two officers stepped between him and Jamal, holding him back. The room erupted into chaos, Daniels shouting, the reporter asking questions, the cameraman capturing every second. Jamal stood unmoving in the center of it all, his presence unshaken. "Get him out of here," one of the senior officers said, his voice cutting through the noise. The younger officers hesitated, but eventually grabbed Daniels by the arms, pulling him toward the back of the station. Daniels' furious shouts echoed off the walls. "You think this is over, Carter? You think you've won?" Jamal watched him go, his heart pounding in his chest. The room slowly fell silent again, all eyes turning toward him. For a moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the low hum of the heater kicking on in the corner. Mitchell stepped beside him, his voice low. "You did it, Jamal. He's done." Jamal's shoulders sagged, though his face remained calm. "It's not over yet." The reporter approached, her pen poised over her notepad. "Mr. Carter, what happens next?" Jamal turned to face her, his voice steady and clear. "What happens next is accountability, for Daniels. For anyone who let him abuse his power. People deserve better than men like him wearing a badge." He glanced toward the hallway where Daniels had disappeared, then back at the reporter. "And I'm going to make sure they get it." The reporter nodded, jotting notes as the cameraman turned his lens toward Jamal. He stood tall, the weight of years of silence finally lifting from his shoulders. But even as he spoke, he knew this was just the beginning. Daniels might have been exposed, but the system that had protected him was still intact. And Jamal Carter wasn't finished. The conference room in the Millbrook Town Hall was packed, a tense hum of quiet conversations, rustling papers, and clicking pens. It wasn't a public forum, but word had spread quickly. Members of the press loitered near the entrance, their cameras kept at bay for now, but their presence was undeniable. Officers, city officials, and community leaders filled the rows of chairs, their faces a mix of stoicism, unease, and curiosity. Jamal Carter sat at the long table at the front of the room, facing his adversary across from him. Officer Daniels leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, a smug smile playing on his lips. The air felt thin, heavy with anticipation. Jamal's heartbeat was steady, though the tension had settled into his bones like concrete. Mitchell sat to his left, flipping through a thick folder of documents, while a stern-faced internal affairs representative sat between them and the officers. "All right," the moderator said, clearing his throat. "We're here to review the allegations of misconduct and abuse of authority against Officer Ryan Daniels of the Millbrook Police Department." Daniels let out a quiet snort of derision. Jamal caught it, but said nothing. He was saving his words. The moderator continued. "Mr. Jamal Carter has provided evidence of multiple instances of harassment and racial profiling connected to Officer Daniels over several years. Officer Daniels has denied these allegations and filed a countercomplaint of aggressive and obstructive behavior from Mr. Carter." Jamal's jaw tightened. Countercomplaint Daniels was attempting to spin it, to muddy the waters. It was a game Jamal had seen played 1,000 times, but he was prepared. "Mr. Carter," the moderator said, turning toward him, "you may begin." Jamal adjusted the mic in front of him, his voice clear and even as it echoed in the room. "Thank you. First, I want to make something clear. I'm not here because of a personal grievance. I'm here because a pattern of abuse has gone unchecked for years. Officer Daniels' behavior this morning was not an isolated incident. It's part of a larger problem." Daniels scoffed, shaking his head, as if the words were ridiculous, but Jamal ignored him. "I've spoken to families in this community, people who were too afraid to speak out when Daniels harassed them. Young men pulled over for no reason, elders treated like criminals because they looked suspicious, and complaints filed that mysteriously disappeared." Jamal reached into the folder Mitchell had prepared and pulled out a document. "This is a record of a complaint filed 3 years ago by a 17-year-old black boy. He was stopped on his way home from school. Daniels claimed he fit the description of a burglary suspect. The boy was searched, humiliated, and later released when no evidence was found." He looked up, his gaze locked on Daniels. "That complaint went nowhere. The family withdrew it after Daniels allegedly threatened the boy with juvie if they pursued it." The room stirred with murmurs, eyes darting to Daniels, who now sat stiff in his chair. His smugness flickered, replaced by a cold glare. "That's a lie," Daniels snapped, leaning forward. "There's no proof." Jamal raised his hand calmly, cutting him off. "I have the statement's witnesses, and that's just one case." He slid a stack of papers forward, his voice unwavering. "There are more records buried, families pressured into silence, people who thought they were powerless to fight back." Daniel's face turned red, his fingers gripping the edges of the table. "You're digging up garbage. None of that proves anything. These are accusations, not facts." Jamal leaned forward slightly, his voice sharpening. "Are you saying every single one of these people is lying, Officer Daniels? That every complaint, every pattern of behavior, is just a coincidence?" Daniels opened his mouth to respond, but the moderator interjected. "Officer Daniels, you'll have your chance to speak." Jamal didn't take his eyes off him. "Your problem, Daniels, is that you're used to people being too afraid to stand up to you, but I'm not afraid of you, and I'm not the only one." Daniels barked out a laugh, though it came out forced and brittle. "You think you're some kind of hero? You don't know what it's like to be on the ground, dealing with real threats. I keep this town safe." "No," Jamal cut in, his voice rising slightly. "You keep this town afraid. There's a difference, and you justify it with your badge, acting like you're above the law." The moderator raised a hand for calm, but the room was already electric. Daniels was seething, his facade cracking for everyone to see. "Don't lecture me," Daniels hissed, pointing a finger at Jamal. "You walk around in your fancy suit, thinking you're better than everyone else. You're just another outsider trying to stir up trouble where there isn't any." Jamal didn't flinch. He felt the weight of every person in the room watching, listening. He chose his next words carefully. "You don't hate me, Daniels," Jamal said, his voice cool and deliberate. "You hate what I represent, a black man who doesn't bow. A black man who isn't intimidated. I walked into that diner this morning with nothing but respect, and you saw that as a challenge." Daniels stood abruptly, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. "You're out of line, Carter." "No, you're out of line," Jamal shot back, his voice booming across the room. He stood too, meeting Daniels eye to eye. "You spit on people like me, on our dignity, our humanity, and then hide behind your badge when we call you out on it." The room fell silent. Daniels stared at Jamal, his face flushed, his breathing ragged. For a moment, the two men stood there, one burning with rage, the other rooted in unshakable resolve. "Enough," the moderator said firmly. "Officer Daniels, sit down." Daniels didn't move at first. His jaw worked as if he wanted to say something else, but he finally dropped back into his chair, the anger still simmering behind his eyes. Jamal turned to the moderator, his voice calm once more. "I'm asking this board, and this community, to look at the facts. To ask themselves how many more people have to suffer before someone says, enough. Daniels isn't just one bad officer, he's part of a system that's failed us all." The moderator nodded, his face grave. "Thank you, Mr. Carter." Jamal sat, his pulse still racing, as he watched the room. Daniels' mask had slipped, his true nature exposed. The murmurs among the officials and officers told him that they'd seen it too, but even as the meeting adjourned, Jamal knew this wasn't over. Daniels' glare followed him as he stood to leave, his voice low and venomous as he passed. "You think you've won, Carter? You have no idea what you've started." Jamal stopped, turning just enough to meet Daniels' glare one last time. "I didn't start this, Daniels. You did." And with that, Jamal walked out, leaving Daniels stewing in his anger. Outside the conference room, Mitchell fell into step beside him, his voice low. "That was risky," he muttered. "Daniels isn't going to let this go." Jamal exhaled slowly, his gaze focused straight ahead. "I know, but he's already lost. He just doesn't see it yet." The doors to the town hall swung open, and Jamal stepped into the cold evening air. Snow fell gently around him, the night quiet and still, but he could feel the storm brewing beneath the surface. Daniels wasn't finished, but neither was he. 2 weeks after the hearing, the Millbrook Police Department released a statement. Following a formal review of Officer Ryan Daniels' conduct, the Millbrook Police Department has terminated his employment. Effective immediately, an independent investigation will be launched to examine systemic misconduct claims. The words were simple, sanitized. Bureaucratic language meant to downplay the severity of what had happened. But to the community of Millbrook, to those who had watched the story unfold, the meaning was clear. Daniels was finished. The headlines followed quickly. Small-town officer terminated amid misconduct scandal, and CEO Jamal Carter calls for police accountability in Millbrook. The weight of the truth had finally crushed the shield Daniels had hidden behind for years. Jamal Carter stood on the steps of the town hall, surrounded by reporters and microphones. It was a cold morning, the air sharp with the scent of snow, but the crowd that had gathered didn't seem to care. He wore no coat despite the chill, his suit pressed, his stance tall and composed. Cameras clicked incessantly, flashes of light cutting through the overcast sky as reporters shouted questions. "Mr. Carter, what message do you hope this sends? Do you believe Daniels was acting alone, or is this part of a larger issue? Are you satisfied with the department's decision?" Jamal raised his hand, and the noise fell to a hush. He let the silence linger for just a moment, ensuring that every eye, every ear, was on him. "Let me be clear," he began, his voice carrying effortlessly over the crowd. "This isn't about one man. This is about accountability. For too long, people like Officer Daniels have abused their power, believing they could act without consequence because the system would protect them. That changes today." He scanned the crowd, his gaze steady and unflinching. "This is just the beginning. The termination of one officer doesn't erase the pain he caused, nor does it solve the problems that allowed him to thrive for so long. There is work to be done, to rebuild trust, to ensure that every person in this community is treated with respect and dignity." A reporter called out, "What's next for you, Mr. Carter? Will you stay involved?" Jamal nodded. "Absolutely. I have a responsibility to use my voice and my resources to push for change. Daniels was exposed because people spoke up, because they refused to be silenced. That's what I intend to do. Keep speaking, keep pushing. I won't stop until justice isn't the exception. It's the norm." The crowd murmured in agreement, some even breaking into applause. Jamal stepped back as Mitchell placed a hand on his shoulder, his voice low. "You handled that perfectly." Jamal turned, his expression calm but resolute. "We're not done. Mitch Daniels was a symptom. The disease is still there." Mitchell sighed, though a faint smile tugged at his lips. "I figured you'd say that. So, what's next?" Jamal looked out over the crowd, then back at the imposing facade of the town hall. "We build something better. That's what's next." Later that evening, Jamal returned to the diner. It was quiet, just as it had been before. No cameras, no reporters, no tension crackling in the air. Ruby's diner was just a diner again, the hum of conversation and the clink of coffee mugs filling the space. As he stepped inside, the bell above the door jingled, and heads turned. This time, though, there were no wary stares or skeptical glances. People nodded in acknowledgement, some even offering small smiles. The young waitress from before, Anna, he'd since learned, approached, her smile brighter than before. "Welcome back, Mr. Carter." "Just Jamal, please," he said softly. "Black coffee if you don't mind." "Coming right up." He settled into the same table by the window, watching the snowfall outside. It felt different now, less heavy, less suffocating. The silence wasn't tension-filled, it was peaceful. The door chimed again, and Jamal glanced up instinctively. This time, it was Bennett, the young officer who had followed Daniels's lead that morning. He paused when he saw Jamal, hesitation flickering across his face. But then, slowly, he approached. "Mr. Carter," Bennett said, his voice careful but genuine. "Do you mind if I sit?" Jamal gestured to the seat across from him. "Not at all." Bennett lowered himself into the chair, his hands clasped tightly on the table. For a moment, he said nothing, his gaze fixed on the scratched linoleum surface. Then he exhaled, looking up. "I wanted to say, I'm sorry," Bennett said quietly. "For that morning. For not speaking up sooner." Jamal studied him, his expression unreadable. "Why didn't you?" Bennett's jaw tightened. "Because it's easier not to. You see someone like Daniels, someone everyone looks up to, someone they're afraid to cross, and you tell yourself it's not your fight, but that doesn't make it right." Jamal nodded slowly. "No, it doesn't. But recognizing it is the first step." Bennett leaned forward, his voice earnest. "I want to do better. I want to be better. If you're serious about pushing for change, I want to help." Jamal considered him for a long moment. He could see the uncertainty in Bennett's face, but also the sincerity, the desire to make amends, to be part of something better. "Then hold yourself accountable," Jamal said. And hold the people around you accountable too. It starts with you, Officer Bennett. Bennett nodded firmly. I will. Anna arrived with Jamal's coffee, placing it in front of him with a smile before disappearing again. The two men sat in silence for a while, the quiet, comfortable, reflective. Finally, Bennett stood, offering Jamal a hand. Thank you, Mr. Carter. Jamal shook it, his grip strong. Don't thank me yet, there's a lot of work to do. I'm ready, Bennett said before walking out. Jamal sat back, his hands wrapped around the warm coffee mug, watching the snow fall through the window. Days turned into weeks, and Jamal's actions began to ripple outward. The independent investigation into the Millbrook Police Department gained traction, uncovering years of overlooked complaints and systemic failures. Community meetings became commonplace, with residents sharing their stories that had been buried for too long. Jamal became a visible leader in the movement for reform, meeting with town officials, activists, and legal teams. He wasn't fighting alone anymore. What started as one confrontation in a small diner had grown into something larger, a movement demanding change. One evening, Mitchell called with an update. They're talking about you on the national news, Jamal. The CEO who took on a town. You're making waves. Jamal smiled faintly, though his voice was steady. It's not about me, it's about them, everyone who's been silenced, everyone who's been afraid to speak. Mitchell chuckled, humble as always. But you're right. This is bigger than you. Jamal looked out the window of his office, the glow of Millbrook's lights stretching into the distance. It always was. The next time Jamal walked into Ruby's diner, the room quieted again. But this time, it was different. People nodded to him in recognition, not out of fear or judgment, but out of respect. He took his seat by the window, sipping his coffee as the snowfall blanketed the quiet town outside. The fight wasn't over. It wouldn't be for a long time. But for the first time in years, Jamal felt something he hadn't felt in a while. Hope. The weight he carried, the weight of quiet power, had shifted. And the world was starting to notice. The snow had stopped falling by the time Jamal Carter stepped out of Ruby's diner, for the last time that winter. The quiet town of Millbrook stretched before him, blanketed in white, the streetlights casting a soft glow on the icy streets. Everything looked still, but Jamal knew stillness didn't mean nothing was happening. Change often began in silence. As he stood by his car, he allowed himself a moment to reflect. The events of the past few weeks had been a whirlwind, a battle fought not with fists or anger, but with truth, persistence, and an unrelenting belief in justice. It hadn't been easy. Exposing Officer Daniels had felt like prying up the floorboards of an old house and finding rot that stretched far deeper than expected. But someone had to do it. Someone always had to start the work, even if they didn't live to see it finished. Jamal had learned that lesson a long time ago. From his father, from his mentors, from the history books that detailed struggles and victories of people who had come before him. They had fought because they had no choice, because backing down would have been the same as surrendering. The confrontation with Daniels had been a tipping point, but the real battle had only begun. The investigation into the Millbrook Police Department had confirmed what many already knew. Daniels was not an anomaly. He was part of a larger systemic problem, a culture that looked the other way, that allowed abuse of power to thrive under the guise of authority. But the revelations didn't stop there. Community members had come forward, sharing their stories, men and women who had been silenced, intimidated, or humiliated by figures meant to serve and protect them. Their voices were no longer whispers in the dark. They were loud, clear, undeniable. And because of those voices, real changes were beginning to take shape. Daniels was gone, his career reduced to a cautionary tale. 2 other officers resigned quietly, their own misconduct unearthed as the investigation continued. Policies were being rewritten, training programs were being evaluated, an independent oversight board was being formed to review police conduct going forward. Jamal knew it wasn't enough, not yet. But it was a start. Sitting in his office a few days later, Jamal found himself flipping through the pages of his own notes, documents, statements, articles. His name had become part of the headlines, though he hadn't asked for it. CEO takes a stand against police corruption. Mitchell had joked that Jamal was becoming an accidental activist, a man with one foot in the corporate world and the other in the fight for justice. Maybe that was true, Jamal thought. But why couldn't it be both? Why couldn't a black man lead in boardrooms and fight for the dignity of his community? The two weren't mutually exclusive. If anything, his success had given him the platform, and the responsibility, to speak for those who couldn't. It was a weight he didn't take lightly. He closed the folder and looked out the window at the city skyline, his reflection faint against the glass. What now, he wondered. It was a question he'd been asking himself since Daniel's downfall. For Jamal, the answer was simple. Keep pushing. The truth was, Officer Daniels wasn't the first, he wouldn't be the last. Racism and abuse of power didn't disappear just because one man fell. It was a cycle, deeply ingrained, carefully protected, and hard to break. But cycles could be broken, systems could change. Jamal believed that he had to believe that. He thought of the people he'd met in the past few weeks. The young boy whose family had been too afraid to file a complaint. The elderly woman who'd finally shared her story after decades of silence. The small business owner who'd been harassed into near ruin. Their stories were part of something bigger. This wasn't just about one man or one town. This was about every community that had been told to stay quiet. Every family that had been left with no choice but to endure. Jamal understood now that his fight wasn't just his own. It belonged to the people who had trusted him to carry their voices. And carry them he would. A week later, Jamal stood before a packed room at the Millbrook Community Center. The space was overflowing with people, young and old, black and white, parents with children on their laps, and local leaders scattered among the crowd. The hum of quiet conversation filled the room, a shared energy of hope and purpose. Jamal stepped up to the podium, clearing his throat as the room fell silent. "Good evening," he began, his voice steady and strong. "When I walked into Ruby's Diner a few weeks ago, I didn't expect any of this. I didn't expect headlines or hearings. I didn't expect Officer Daniels to expose his true colors for everyone to see. But I did expect to be treated with dignity. I expected to drink my coffee in peace. And when that didn't happen, I knew I couldn't stay silent." He scanned the room, pausing to let his words settle. "What happened to me wasn't new. It wasn't unique. It's something that has happened to too many people for too long, and for years, we've been told that speaking up won't change anything, that it's safer to stay quiet." He shook his head. "But staying quiet is how we got here. Silence isn't safety, it's surrender, and we can't afford to surrender anymore." A ripple of agreement moved through the crowd. What we're doing here today, coming together, telling our stories, demanding better, it matters. It's how we move forward. It's how we make sure no one else has to go through what we've been through. He looked toward the back of the room, where Mitchell stood with a small group of community organizers. Next to him, Jamal spotted Officer Bennett, sitting quietly with his hands clasped in his lap. The young officer met Jamal's gaze and gave a small nod. A promise unspoken, but understood. Jamal turned back to the crowd. "Change won't happen overnight. It's going to take time, work, and all of us holding each other accountable. But it will happen. It has to. Because we deserve better. Our children deserve better." He let out a steady breath, his voice softening. "I don't know where this ends, I don't have all the answers, but I know this. I'm not done fighting, and neither are you." The room erupted into applause, the sound swelling like a wave. Jamal stepped back, his heart full but steady. For the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to feel it. Pride, not in himself, but in the people around him. They weren't just fighting for change, they were the change. As the evening wrapped up, Jamal lingered near the door, shaking hands and exchanging quiet words with the people who approached him. Many thanked him, some offered encouragement, and a few shared their own stories, each one a reminder of why this fight mattered. When the room finally emptied, Jamal stepped outside. The air was cold and sharp, the sky clear and full of stars. He stood there for a moment, hands in his pockets, breathing in the stillness. The work wasn't over, it never would be. But tonight had proven something important. Change was possible. As he walked to his car, Jamal thought of all the people who had come before him, those who had fought, struggled, and sacrificed to move the needle just a little further. He was part of that legacy now, and it was a responsibility he would carry with pride. He climbed into his car and sat for a moment, staring out at the quiet streets of Millbrook. Somewhere out there, men like Daniels still existed, still wielded power they didn't deserve. But now, they knew that people like Jamal Carter wouldn't stay silent. He started the engine and drove into the night, his mind clear, his resolve unshaken. Because the fight for justice was far from over, and Jamal was just getting started.